The manila envelope landed with a sharp slap against Diane Holloway's pristine white kitchen counter, its contents promising another round of suburban warfare. Marlene Whitmore, HOA president, self-appointed neighborhood czar, and the most notorious Karen within a 50-mile radius, had struck again. Diane's fingers trembled slightly as she slid out the official-looking document. Violation notice. Again. This time it was about her vintage pickup truck parked just 6 inches outside the designated parking zone. 6 inches. In the grand scheme of suburban perfection that Marlene had meticulously constructed, those 6 inches might as well have been a declaration of total anarchy. The irony wasn't lost on Diane. She was a fifth-generation farmer whose family had owned this land long before the cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates had sprung up like invasive weeds. Her property technically predated the HOA by decades, a fact she reminded the board countless times. But Marlene Whitmore didn't care about history. She cared about uniformity, compliance, and the soul-crushing precision of suburban regulations. Marlene was more than just an HOA president. She was a force of bureaucratic nature, a tornado of red tape and petty enforcement that swept through the neighborhood with terrifying efficiency. Her gray hair was always perfectly coiffed, her pantsuit always pressed, and her clipboard always within arm's reach. She knew every single bylaw's clause by heart and took personal satisfaction in pointing out even the most minuscule infractions. The current violation was particularly ridiculous. Diane's vintage Ford F-100, a family heirloom passed down through generations, sat proudly on her property. Its faded blue paint and slightly rusted fenders told stories of harvest seasons, cattle drives, and family history. To Marlene, it was nothing more than an eyesore that didn't conform to the neighborhood's immaculate aesthetic. Diane remembered the last HOA meeting where she confronted Marlene. The fluorescent lights of the community center had cast harsh shadows as Marlene methodically went through her list of infractions. Property setback measurements, fence height regulations, grass length specifications. Each citation delivered with the precision of a military commander dispatching orders. Ms. Holloway, Marlene had said, her voice as sharp as her pressed collar, a well-maintained community requires everyone's cooperation. Your truck is not just a vehicle. It's a visual representation of community standards. Diane had bit back her retort. How could she explain that this truck represented something far more profound than their sterile suburban ideals? It was a connection to her family's legacy, to generations of hard work and genuine living. But today was different. Today, Diane decided would be the day she drew her line in the perfectly measured, regulation-approved sand. She picked up her phone and dialed. The conversation that was about to unfold would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire Willow Creek Estates. The electric fence installers arrived precisely at 7:30 a.m., their heavy trucks rumbling down the gravel drive and shattering the morning's tranquility. Marlene Whitmore, who happened to be conducting her daily neighborhood patrol, nearly dropped her clipboarded morning report. "What in the name of zoning regulations is happening here?" she muttered, her sensible, low-heeled shoes crunching against the gravel as she approached. The lead technician, a burly man named Rick with forearms like oak branches and a no-nonsense demeanor, didn't even glance in her direction. Diane had specifically instructed them to ignore any interruptions, a detail that would drive Marlene absolutely mad. The fence wasn't just any ordinary barrier. It was a state-of-the-art system designed to protect livestock with multiple wire strands carrying a potent but non-lethal electrical charge. Bright warning signs were strategically placed every 50 feet, their bold red lettering a clear message. Approach at your own risk. Diane watched from her kitchen window, a cup of coffee warming her hands. She knew exactly what she was doing. For years, Marlene and the HOA board had repeatedly trespassed onto her property, measuring, photographing, and citing imaginary infractions. They'd walk right up to her barn, past her vegetable gardens, completely disregarding her privacy and property rights. This fence would change everything. The installation took most of the morning. Rick and his team worked with military precision, setting posts, stringing wire, connecting the sophisticated electrical control box that would monitor the entire perimeter. Each post was placed exactly 12 feet apart, a measurement Diane had researched meticulously to ensure maximum coverage and compliance with agricultural fencing regulations. By noon, Marlene could no longer contain herself. She marched up to the property line, her clipboard clutched like a weapon, her pantsuit pressed to razor-sharp perfection. "Ms. Holloway," she called out, her voice cutting through the afternoon heat. "This fence requires HOA approval. You cannot simply install agricultural infrastructure without submitting proper documentation." Diane emerged from her barn, wiping her hands on a well-worn cloth. She'd been expecting this confrontation. "Actually, Marlene," she said coolly, "this is agricultural property. I'm exempt from most HOA restrictions due to my agricultural designation. Every single wire, every single post is precisely where it needs to be." Rick, overhearing the exchange, suppressed a smile. He'd dealt with plenty of HOA disputes, and Diane was handling this masterfully. Marlene's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. Her meticulously maintained composure was cracking. For the first time in years, someone was standing up to her systematic neighborhood control. "You'll hear from the board about this," she sputtered, taking a step forward. Diane said nothing. She simply pointed to the bright red warning signs. Marlene took another step. The sharp, sudden crack of the electric fence's warning pulse filled the air. Not enough to cause serious harm, but definitely enough to make a point. Marlene leaped backward, her perfectly pressed pantsuit now slightly askew, her clipboard tumbling to the ground. The game had changed, and Diane was just getting started. The emergency HOA board meeting was called within 48 hours of the electric fence incident. Marlene Whitmore had spent those 2 days nursing both her bruised ego and the slight static burn she'd received from Diane Holloway's carefully engineered deterrent system. Conference Room B of the Willow Creek Estates Community Center looked more like a war room than a typical neighborhood meeting space. Printouts of Diane's property, aerial photographs, and zoning maps covered every available surface. Board members whispered and shuffled papers, their collective energy a mixture of frustration and barely contained excitement. Harold Thompson, the board's legal advisor, a retired corporate lawyer with a perpetual need to justify his monthly retainer, adjusted his reading glasses. "The agricultural exemption is problematic," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone who believed paperwork could solve anything. "Ms. Holloway's property technically predates our HOA bylaws by nearly 3 decades. Marlene's manicured fingers drummed an impatient rhythm against her leather portfolio. She spent hours preparing her case, collecting every possible violation, every potential leverage point against Diane Holloway. "We can't let her think she's above the rules," Marlene hissed, leaning forward. Her perfectly coiffed gray hair remained immaculately in place, a testament to her commitment to control. "If we allow one property to deviate, the entire fabric of our community unravels." The board members nodded. They understood the stakes. Willow Creek Estates wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a carefully constructed ecosystem of conformity, where every blade of grass, every mailbox, every exterior paint color was a carefully negotiated compromise. But Diane Holloway was different. A fifth-generation farmer who had watched her family's land slowly get surrounded by cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns, she represented something the HOA feared most: independent spirit. Harold spread out a series of documents. "We have several potential approaches," he began methodically. "First, we could challenge her agricultural designation. Second, we could argue that the electric fence violates safety regulations. Third," a sharp knock interrupted his presentation. The conference room door opened, revealing a stern-looking woman in a crisp municipal inspector's uniform. Her badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "I'm Jennifer Rodriguez from the County Agricultural and Zoning Department," she announced, her voice crisp and authoritative. "We've received multiple complaints about a recent fence installation on the Holloway property." Marlene's smile was predatory. This was her moment. She had meticulously documented every potential violation, every possible angle of attack. What she didn't know was that Diane had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. Jennifer Rodriguez pulled out her own set of documents, her expression unreadable. The next few moments would determine whether Marlene's carefully constructed plan would triumph or spectacularly implode. The board members leaned forward, collectively holding their breath. Marlene's fingers continued their nervous drumming, the only sound in the suddenly tense room. The Rodriguez file hit the conference table with the weight of a legal grenade. Jennifer's expression remained neutral, a carefully practiced mask of professional detachment that had been honed through years of navigating suburban bureaucratic minefields. "Ms. Whitmore," she began, her tone clinical, "your complaint regarding the Holloway property contains several inaccuracies." Marlene's perfectly maintained composure began to crack. Her fingers, which had been drumming a nervous rhythm, now gripped the edge of the conference table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jennifer continued, spreading out a series of meticulously prepared documents. "First, the electric fence meets all agricultural safety standards. Second, Ms. Holloway's property is indeed grandfathered under original agricultural zoning. Third, and most importantly, your repeated unauthorized entries onto private property constitute multiple instances of trespassing." The room fell silent. Harold Thompson, the board's legal advisor, began to sweat despite the room's regulated temperature. Marlene's world was collapsing around her. For years, she had wielded the HOA bylaws like a precise surgical instrument, cutting through neighbors' resistance with bureaucratic precision. She had measured grass lengths, monitored paint colors, tracked mailbox dimensions with a zealot's dedication. No detail was too small, no violation too minor to escape her notice. But Diane Holloway was different. The Rodriguez file contained photographic evidence of Marlene's repeated unauthorized property inspections, GPS timestamps, detailed logs. Each document was a nail in the coffin of Marlene's neighborhood reign of terror. The fence, Jennifer continued, is a direct response to repeated privacy violations. Ms. Holloway has documentation of no fewer than 17 unauthorized entries onto her property in the past 2 years. Harold cleared his throat. It was a sound of surrender. Marlene's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. She had spent decades crafting the perfect suburban ecosystem. Willow Creek Estates was her masterpiece, a neighborhood where uniformity wasn't just expected, it was enforced. And now a farmer, a stubborn, independent woman with dirt under her fingernails and generations of land ownership, was dismantling everything she had built. Ms. Whitmore, Jennifer said finally, I recommend you cease all actions against the Holloway property. Immediately. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Outside the conference room window, the perfectly manicured landscape of Willow Creek Estates seemed to shimmer, a facade about to crack. Marlene stared, her reflection fragmented in the glass, watching her carefully constructed world begin to unravel. The electric fence had done more than protect a farm. It had drawn a line in the sand, a boundary between bureaucratic control and genuine independence. And Marlene Whitmore had just been served her first real lesson in respecting that boundary. Defeat didn't sit well with Marlene Whitmore. The days following the municipal inspection festered like an unhealed wound, her pride demanding retribution. She might have been temporarily neutralized, but she was far from defeated. The Holloway farm sat like a defiant monument at the edge of Willow Creek Estates. Its weathered fences, vintage truck, and now infamous electric barrier stood in stark contrast to the cookie-cutter houses surrounding it. Marlene began her counteroffensive the only way she knew how, through meticulous, relentless documentation. She started taking photographs, not just casual snapshots, but carefully calculated images that might reveal some minute violation. A slightly overgrown hedge, a wheelbarrow left out of place, anything that could be construed as a potential infraction. Her silver Mercedes would creep along the property line, telephoto lens at the ready. She parked just outside the electric fence's warning zone, capturing every possible angle of Diane's property. The farm became her obsession, her white whale of suburban regulation. What Marlene didn't realize was that Diane was watching, every single time. The local farmers, a tight-knit community that predated the suburban sprawl, had been quietly monitoring the situation. They'd heard about the electric fence incident, about Jennifer Rodriguez's takedown of the HOA board. Word travels fast in rural communities, especially when someone stands up to bureaucratic overreach. Tom Grayson, who owned the neighboring farm, stopped by one afternoon. His pickup truck kicked up dust as he pulled into Diane's driveway, a thermos of coffee in hand. She's still circling like a buzzard, he commented, nodding toward the distant silver Mercedes. Diane didn't even look up from the irrigation system she was repairing. I know. Tom chuckled. You got more patience than I would. Most folks would have lost their minds by now. The truth was more strategic. Diane was collecting her own evidence. Every time Marlene's car appeared, Diane's security cameras captured the moment. GPS coordinates, timestamps, license plate numbers. She was building a case, not out of spite, but out of necessary protection. The farmers understood something that HOA never would. Land wasn't just a piece of property to be regulated and controlled. It was a living, breathing entity with its own history, its own rights. As the summer heat settled over Willow Creek Estates, the tension became a tangible thing. The perfectly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes seemed to vibrate with an underlying current of anticipation. Something was going to break. Something was going to give. Marlene continued her surveillance, unaware that each photograph, each slow drive-by, was digging her into a deeper hole. Her obsession with Diane's property had become more than a mission. It had become a personal vendetta. And vendettas in the world of rural land ownership rarely end well for the newcomer. The electric fence stood as a silent guardian, a warning, a promise of consequences for those who didn't understand boundaries, literal or metaphorical. The breaking point came on a humid Tuesday morning when most of Willow Creek Estates was still asleep. Marlene Whitmore had finally convinced herself that she could outsmart the electric fence. Armed with rubber-soled boots, insulated gloves, and a desperate determination, she planned her most audacious mission yet. Her target, photographic evidence of a zoning violation that would finally bring Diane Holloway to her knees. The pre-dawn light had barely begun to paint the sky when Marlene's silver Mercedes rolled to a silent stop just beyond the farm's perimeter. She had studied the fence's electrical pattern, convinced she could find a weakness. Her clipboard was secured, her camera prepared, her resolve hardened by weeks of humiliation. What she didn't know was that Diane had been expecting this moment for weeks. The first step Marlene took across the property line triggered a sequence of events she could never have anticipated. It wasn't just the electric fence that responded. It was an elaborate system Diane had meticulously designed with Rick, the fence installation expert. Floodlights erupted, bathing the entire area in stark white illumination. Strategically placed motion-activated sprinklers burst to life, creating a water barrier that would make any intruder's expensive pantsuit look like a sad, soggy mess. Meanwhile, a loud alarm began to wail, not just any alarm, but one calibrated to sound exactly like the county sheriff's emergency response tone. Marlene froze. The sprinklers hit her from multiple angles. Her carefully pressed outfit, the weapon of bureaucratic warfare, was now clinging to her body, mascara running, hair plastered against her forehead. The clipboard flew from her hands, landing in a muddy puddle created by the precision-aimed sprinklers. But the true masterstroke was yet to come. As Marlene stood there, completely disoriented, the farm's security cameras began the program's sequence. Not only were they recording every humiliating moment, but they were simultaneously uploading the footage to multiple locations: the county agricultural office, the local sheriff's department, and most deliciously, the Willow Creek Estate's HOA board's official email. Tom Grayson, who had been alerted by the security system, pulled up in his pickup truck. He didn't even try to hide his amusement. "Morning, Marlene," he called out, tipping his hat. "Looks like you might have missed a few details in your zoning research." Diane appeared on the farmhouse porch, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The entire confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes would become neighborhood legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing beyond one's boundaries. Marlene Whitmore, the terror of Willow Creek Estates, stood defeated, soaked, humiliated. Her carefully constructed world of bureaucratic control had just been systematically dismantled by a farmer who understood something she never would. True power isn't about control. It's about knowing exactly how to protect what's yours. The aftermath of Marlene's spectacular defeat rippled through Willow Creek Estates like a shockwave. Within 48 hours, the infamous video had gone viral among local community groups, municipal offices, and neighborhood association networks. Social media memes featuring a bedraggled Marlene emerged faster than anyone could have predicted. Harold Thompson, the HOA's legal advisor, called an emergency board meeting. The conference room felt more like a funeral parlor: hushed whispers, averted gazes, and an overwhelming sense of impending doom. Marlene sat at the far end of the table, her once immaculate pantsuit replaced by a generic department store outfit that seemed to symbolize her fall from grace. "We have a serious problem," Harold began, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "The municipal office has not only dismissed our complaints against Ms. Holloway, but has now launched an investigation into our board's repeated harassment." Board members shifted uncomfortably. The pristine facade of Willow Creek Estates was cracking, revealing the ugly underbelly of suburban micromanagement. Jennifer Rodriguez from the County Agricultural Department had been thorough. Her report detailed 17 separate instances of unauthorized property access, each meticulously documented with GPS coordinates, timestamps, and photographic evidence. What had begun as Marlene's crusade against one farmer had transformed into a comprehensive examination of the HOA's systematic overreach. The local news picked up the story. A local investigative reporter named Sarah Chen arrived, her digital recorder always running. "This isn't just about one farm," she told her viewers. "This is about property rights, municipal overreach, and the sometimes ridiculous world of homeowners associations." Diane Holloway, for her part, remained characteristically calm. She continued her farm work, answered questions when necessary, but never gloated. The farmers in the surrounding areas watched with a mixture of admiration and quiet solidarity. Tom Grayson stopped by with a bottle of locally produced wine. "You've done more than just protect your farm," he told Diane. "You made a statement about community, about respect." The statement had cost Marlene everything. The HOA board voted to remove her as president. Her carefully constructed reputation, decades of neighborhood control, had been dismantled in a matter of weeks. The very system she had used to control others had become her ultimate downfall. But Diane understood something deeper. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about drawing a line, about maintaining dignity, about protecting not just a piece of land, but a way of life that had existed long before suburban developments sprouted like artificial flowers. As the sun set over Willow Creek Estates, the electric fence stood as a symbol, not of aggression, but of boundaries, of respect, of a farmer's right to protect what generations had built. Marlene Whitmore's reign was over, and a new chapter was about to begin. 6 months later, Willow Creek Estates had transformed. The rigid uniformity that Marlene had enforced for decades began to soften, replaced by a more nuanced understanding of community. Diane Holloway's electric fence remained a silent monument to the power of standing one's ground. But it was more than just a physical barrier now. It had become a symbol of resistance against mindless bureaucratic control. The new HOA board, chastened by the very public implosion of their previous administration, approached things differently. They'd learned that community wasn't about perfect mailboxes or uniform lawn heights. It was about respect, about understanding, Marlene Whitmore had disappeared from the neighborhood. Rumors circulated she'd moved to a retirement community in Florida or perhaps to another suburb where she might restart her crusade of control. But here, in Willow Creek Estates, her legacy was nothing more than a cautionary tale. Tom Grayson and the other local farmers found themselves invited to community events. Their agricultural heritage, once seen as an inconvenience, was now celebrated. Children from the suburban homes began to learn about local farming, about the land's history that predated their manicured streets. Diane continued to work her farm, largely unchanged. The vintage Ford truck still sat in its spot, a little more rust, a lot more stories. The electric fence remained not as a weapon, but as a boundary, a clear, respectful line between her world and the encroaching suburban landscape. At the annual neighborhood barbecue, event that would have been unthinkable under Marlene's regime, Diane found herself surrounded by neighbors genuinely interested in her farm's history. Young children listened in awe as she talked about generations of farming, about the land's stories. The municipal investigation had broader implications. Other HOAs in the county began to review their practices. Property rights became a topic of serious discussion. Diane hadn't just won a personal battle. She'd sparked a broader conversation about community, respect, and the delicate balance between individual rights and collective living. Jennifer Rodriguez, the county inspector who had been instrumental in exposing the HOA's overreach, visited the farm occasionally. Each time she'd smile at the electric fence, a reminder of how one person's stand could create meaningful change. As the sun set over Willow Creek Estates, the landscape looked different, not just in its physical appearance, but in its spirit. The rigid lines had softened. The artificial barriers were coming down. And at the edge of the development, Diane Holloway's farm stood as it always had, a testament to resilience, to history, to the simple power of knowing exactly where to draw the line.